the dots that we placed on one of the triangles.
Jeremy, that was it. It's working.
That's always, if you get any kind of error, it has to do with the snap.
I thought I had more balls there. Just
Yeah, that one was 64 is what I can get to that.
did you get it then? Cool.
Change some.
Right.
It looks cool.
And there's 6 of them.
Yeah.
How to like change the grid spacing for it to
So
work?
I didn't know that.
You can just select it and do it.
Yeah, I mean like some of them.
Occasionally.
Honestly, my no cuts issue. Maybe that was just
Some of these curves are really tight too, though, so that might be an issue.
I might try to do more segments on it, so like they're smaller,
Okay.
so we can follow the curve a little bit better.
It's perfection. This is what I'm doing. This is my thesis right there.
But you guys is working on a lot of those.
Yeah, it works. This one is.
Yeah, you see
Hi.
that?
I'm lovely. Like,
Yeah.
it's like I don't feel like I'm being any more weird than usual. Ben, am I being any more strange than I normally am? He shook his head no.
I mean, maybe I'm just in a funky mood today.
Oh,
Figure it out.
Totally different.
Maybe it's heavy.
Oh, I forgot Dan's camera's on. That's gonna be funny.
My house making funny noises.
I was singing a song. Ben would have appreciated it right then.
Oh, of course.
I was worried about this camera here.
What is the RSS reader?
RSSs. We need to have the curve that we had like installed on, like that.
Did he say no?
Yes.
Yes, he said no.
That's correct.
I was confused. I was shaking my head yes. I was like, wait, yes to no. I said yes to no. No, yes. No, we don't need it. Yes, we do need it.
Right,
Yes, we don't need it.
right.
That's just the reaction I want. Thank you, Ben. We're not in. We have 2 minutes. I couldn't get there. If you're on your phone.
All right, we'll get started in about a minute. For those of you that didn't hear me earlier, we need to have our file from where we left off last class. So if you can, make sure you have that loaded up.
How do we change this?
I can do street view on my phone. It's a big deal.
You don't really need your surface test area, but you'll need eventually a surface to test it on. You can always recreate one. It doesn't have to be the one you were using for homework.
I don't know how to do this. I've got it on there. I'm sorry.
So everyone got Revit loaded up in your component?
How do we change this thing in here when we have these things, like these dots? Like, where did it? Oh, maybe I just wasn't there.
Yeah, you want to drag this
Oh,
off
I
to the
forgot
side
to
so you can see it a little bit better.
I'm used to my computer.
So it's the,
Was it this good? Oh yeah, we had that bigger. That's why I can't see it. There we go.
you got it right there.
Okay. Just making sure it's on.
Okay, so today we're going to continue where we left off. Last time we were working on the diagrid. That's basically our rectangle with the intersecting diagonal. And then we've got these 2 triangular pieces. what we're going to be doing is continuing the idea of how to create an offset, and then actually applying some voids into this form. And eventually, we may not get to it today, but definitely next class we'll get into how within our parameters and our formulas, we can actually impose some conditional statements, such as if something's true, do this one particular calculation. If it's false, then return some other number. So that if you look at this surface that's off to the right, I've got a lot of variation in it. Maybe not as much as I'd like at this moment, but not every panel is exactly the same. Every single panel is changing depending on a conditional statement and then a particular formula. So for now, I'm going to close out of those guys. We want to make sure we're in our form where we left off. And you'll notice that when you loaded your component back up, you probably noticed this with your homework assignment, we hid a bunch of items at the very end to actually place these dots and get them to move up and down. But when you exit out of this and then load your file back up, everything shows up again. That's because we were using just temporary hides, using the sunglasses down below. When we get into the project environment, which we'll be getting into next week, we can do permanent hides. But for pretty much when you're working in a family environment, everything's going to be temporary, which means when you do exit out, everything will come back to view when you load it back up. You should have a element that looks like this. You've got your pipe rails, and then our spheres on each of the corners. And then the last thing that we were doing is we had parameters set for an offset and offset inverse that had to deal with the normalized position of all of these points. So if I change my offset from right now 0.25 to 0.125, all of the points should move towards the end. Does everyone have that? Doesn't matter what the form or whatever your value is, just as long as your points are moving. What we're going to do right now is select everything and select your filter. I'm going to check, once this filter dialog box comes up, I'm going to hit the button that says check none. And then I'm going to go back and check. I want to see adaptive points, my dimensions, reference lines, and reference points. And hit apply and OK. Once you have that, basically you've only selected those items. I'm going to go down to the temporary hide and isolate, and I'm going to select isolate element. So basically all we're looking at again is our reference lines and our points. Everyone,
Where do we find the filter thing again?
if you select everything, you get the filter button that pops up. The filter is for selection purposes only. So it's basically saying, this is all the items in the category that you've selected. And now you can deselect, or I always like to just do check none and then selectively add the items I want to see. I need adaptive points, dimensions, reference lines, and points. Once you exit out of that, you do your temporary hide isolate, and I want to isolate the elements. So that basically I'm getting rid of all the other items I haven't selected. What I'd like to do is on the next triangle, so we've got this top piece, down below we're going to add another set of points that are going to be equal to another offset, because I eventually want these two offsets to be different. So add a parameter called offset 2, and remember it needs to be a number. And then again we'll need a offset 2 inverse, and that will have to be a number as well. You can by default just set the offset to some number like 0.3. You want it to be a little bit different than the original offset. And And our offset 2 inverse needs to have the same formula, the 1 minus, but this time it'll be offset 2. Everyone got that? We're getting there? Okay. Now I'm going to select my point element, and again, I just need 2 points around each of these corner adaptive points. And then when you select one of those points, look at your normalized curve parameter and then associate it with the new offsets that we just created. So in this case, this one's greater than 0.5, so that's going to be my offset inverse. This other one should be the offset because it's less than 0.5. Again, do that for each of your points that you just placed. While you guys are catching up, I'm going to do a save as. Just call this. Every time you do something good, you want to hit save. Let me know if you guys are there or not. So basically when you're selecting those points, if it's under 0.5 and you look at your normalized parameter, that will be associated with your initial offset because those numbers are lower. And then your offset inverse, because we're doing 1 minus offset, that should be a higher number. So if you're greater than 0.5, you'd be using the offset inverse. Everyone there?
You said we needed to add 2 more points to every line, correct?
Yeah, so on your lower triangle, you need 2 points on either side of each adaptive point. Your adaptive point are the endpoints. Okay, so I'm going to draw a set of reference lines. So make sure at the very top here, you've got reference selected, and then the line command. And then we also need to make sure 3D snapping is turned on. I'm going to turn off the chain because we're only going to do kind of 1-line segments. Essentially, each of these points that are near the end, we want to snap and draw a line to each one of them. So I've got that corner. I'll do the same thing. You want to make sure you're snapping to the points that are associated with the offsets, and then the ones that are associated with the offset 2s. I'm going to do that on both triangles, and do make sure you're getting that point snap. So you should have kind of this web that looks like this.
Get an arrow on one that says line is slightly off axis.
Don't worry about it. Hit okay.
Okay.
Basically, that means you're slightly orthogonal, and it's just warning you. I don't know why it gives you that warning.
That's highlighting a plane when I'm trying to connect the points. Like it's not allowing me to snap to the.
Do you have your 3D snapping on?
That's what it is.
Yep.
You should have two.
So if you've been able to get that to snap together, go ahead and test it out by loading up your parameters again and changing the numbers and hitting apply. And make sure that your points and your lines are moving up and down the triangle. And I'm always keeping them slightly offset from one another. And again, hit save. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do something similar again where I'm going to draw a reference line, but this time with my 3D snapping on, I'm also going to select chain. And you're going to draw a chain of lines, making sure that you snap to the midpoint of each of these lines. So you should get a little triangle at the midpoint. And I'm basically making an inscribed triangle. And when you're done, just hit escape, and you've connected all three. And do the same thing on the lower triangle. And again, if you've done that, go ahead and test out to make sure that your inscribed triangle should adjust with the change of the offset parameters. Everyone got that? Now what we're basically doing is we're going to be creating a solid surface out of each of the triangles and then cutting a hole through it. And now, since we have all these reference lines, our void hole will actually adjust depending on our offset. But there's a couple different tricks that we need to do for when we start working with voids. We always have to ensure that our void is going to cut through the solid. And one thing I'm going to do is create a couple different parameters here. One's going to be just called thickness. This will be the thickness of the actual solid surface. The next parameter will be...
The length parameter?
Yeah, that'll be length. And then the next parameter, which will also be a length, will be something like void offset. I'm just going to give the thickness parameter like a 1-inch number. And then my void offset is actually going to be a formula, which will be thickness. I'll just do times 6 for now. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Everyone get those set? Okay. So now to make the solids for each of the triangles, if we select the first triangle and then it's Control-click the last leg at the very kind of in the middle there. I'm going to select Create Form, Solid Form, and when you get your little thumbnail pictures that pop up, pick the one that looks like it's extruding. What was that error you got, Brian?
So I was unable to do it.
Don't select the interior, just the exterior triangle. We're just making a solid, so select the exterior of one triangle, you need a control, and select the other leg to close the shape, and then say solid form, and make sure you're selecting the one that looks like it's extruded. Now before you exit out of this portion where we've just made the extrusion, if you look over to the left, you have another set of parameters that are associated with this extruded form. It says positive offset and negative offset. We can choose those buttons and then click on the thickness parameter for the positive and do the same thing for the negative. Basically what we're doing is extruding this form 1 inch up and 1 inch down from the reference line.
Which one was the color again?
They're both equal to thickness.
Oh.
What do you have highlighted right now? I'm sorry,
Do you not see this part right here?
yeah.
Okay.
Or no, don't.
Okay, so make sure, if you don't see that, you probably need to tab over until you can select your form element, the extruded element. Once you do that, you should get the positive offset and negative offset properties that you can set equal to thickness.
What did you extrude before that? I think that's the part I missed then.
So you don't have an extrusion?
No.
Okay. The outside edges of this one triangle, and then the control, select this other part, create form, and then make sure you select the icon that shows that it's extruding. Then before you exit out of that, you can hit the positive thickness and negative thickness. And we're going to do that to the form on the bottom as well. So repeat the same exact steps. So when you're done, you should have, if you turn on your hidden line, you should see 2 solid triangles. You want to hit save. So the next part is we're going to select the triangle that's on the interior, and it should highlight all 3 edges. If it doesn't, you may have to control click. But because we drew it as a chain, it should recognize that they're all together. And then this time when you do create form, you want to use the pull down arrow and make sure you're selecting the void form. And again, pick the one that's on the left, this little thumbnail. And before you exit out, you have a positive offset and negative offset again. This time we'll make those equal to the void offset on both directions. So basically what we're doing is ensuring that our void, because we typed in that formula, thickness times 6, our void offset is always going to be greater than whatever our surface thickness is. Because if you were to have a particular extreme bending of your form, let's say I only do thickness times 2 for now. That probably will still work.
Why would that give me the positive and negative option whenever I click void form?
And you'll want to do the same thing with the other element. So Clint, if you select your triangle, the inscribed triangle, make sure all three are selected, and then create form. And make sure you're doing a void form. And you should get the two icons down at the bottom or somewhere on the screen. Make sure you pick the one on the left. Then before you exit, you should have a positive offset and
It
negative.
doesn't give me the constraints.
Mine doesn't give a dimension line that I can set.
It's not giving you the constraints.
No.
Hold on. Who's not getting that to pop up on their screen? Change those to, you drew those with model lines. If you're getting that error, that inscribed triangle needs to be drawn with the reference lines. If you draw it with model lines, you're not going to get those offsets. Yeah, so far everything that we've done has basically been with the reference lines. Except for when we did the spheres, those were actual models.
Yeah, the points are just normal, right, though, they're not reference points.
Points, basically points no matter whenever you place a point element, it's always going to be a reference.
Okay.
I guess, yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
see.
every time I'm doing it, like, for some reason, these other forms are popping up on my triangle, like, there's a twin cylinder on there and a bigger circle around that.
Alright, hold on.
Yeah.
If you happen to have a set of lines that might be model lines, for instance, if I draw a model line off to the side here. So a model line will be, it's hard to see on the screen, up on the board here, but if you look on your screen, a model line will show up as black, and when you hover over it, it'll say model lines. Your reference lines will be green, and they'll show up as reference lines when you hover over it, and you also get these kind of these dashed planes that are associated with it. If you select any of those lines, if you look in the properties, down at the very bottom, there's identity data, and it says is reference line, and there's a box that isn't checked. If you want to make this a model line to a reference line, you could just check it, and then it's changed from a model to a reference line, and then vice versa. If you don't want this to be a reference line, you uncheck the box. So instead of recreating the wheel if you happen to mess up by selecting the wrong model or reference line, just keep that in mind. Alright, so you got
Not sure what that, selected.
I wish you could see this. I can't turn my computer to you. It's a birdie. I'm a birdie.
What are you doing tonight?
Huh?
What are you doing tonight?
It's Thursday. Abs. Wednesday.
Smalls are
Abs. Friday.
I wonder if it reads
We didn't do one.
somehow
Yes, that's so that means maybe
easily
Friday.
selected.
My abs still hurt from Tuesday. I'm just kidding, we can do abs.
My only ever hurts it. It's not the whole thing, it's just the right side.
Oh, mine's usually here. Your left
It's
side is
much,
stronger.
it's much better than
The first time.
oh. Much better.
It looks like it might be.
I didn't do it.
Maybe that was actually touching your
Oh,
points
good.
that you're making.
I mean, I was
Maybe go to your parameters and
I
make your
said I
sphere
did
radius
my
like really small. So that
Okay.
That's literally what I did. I went home and.
Or I can change these.
No, I can't. I have to go home and write. Eat dinner and go to bed.
after the gym.
After the gym.
I don't remember which one was my first. Not that it really matters.
That's your choice.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're done, you should have your two voids. that when you test out your parameters, of course your void should also adjust. And then the next item is we can go ahead and select our sunglasses and say reset temporary height isolate, so that we see our spheres and pipe rails. And now if you can load up a new conceptual mass, or if you have one handy, actually gonna load up. So if you get some kind of a complex form, something that looks like paper, and go ahead and load up your parameter that we just made and apply it to a test surface. You'll probably have to think for a minute. If you happen to get any kind of errors that happen to say cannot make form, and it's asking you to delete some of your components, that is pretty much 99% of the time a result of not snapping your reference lines to reference points and making sure that everything's connected. If that's the case and you keep getting an error message, basically you've got something that's not snapped. And it's taking a little while here to generate.
Are you sure it is? Or, is this something that you can move to?
Why is it out of the box?
Out of the box, what do you mean?
Like it's past line. Maybe if you turn it, maybe it's not. Maybe it dips down or something there.
It was actually trimming it.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I
I don't think I've ever seen
feel
it.
like I always have interesting things happen.
Can you rotate around? Is it?
I don't know, maybe I just commented on
Might be a while too.
Oh, okay. It's on a flat surface.
Whatever. You can just spawn up right there though. Minor details.
Just select your.
I got another edition on too.
I have some that look a little jagged.
So it looks like
That's
your
to be
second
expected.
triangle must
You should just
not
select
have
the.
been snapped
Yeah,
correctly.
just like that.
So it looks like it's
No,
treating it at the original size that you were drawing it at. So this is like
No, it's only showing up that one time.
And you got weird,
You probably need to read your
kind
surface.
of void going through it. Yeah, it should
Oh,
be
that's
filling
not
in
how
here.
it's drawn.
So somehow these,
And now it's like your line.
but if you go ahead and move some of these points up and down, like the end points. Yeah, the dragon.
Well, you can just like what the line is.
So I think that,
No, just lift
yeah,
it.
that one's the
There you go.
problem.
Okay. Now you can make
And
a
so
surface
the
and
void is
then
doing
touch it.
something different.
Mine's so jagged. That's why.
You, well, see how
You have
there's a little
something
cut
to-
right there?
Like rotate around it.
You might want to,
You might be hovering over each other. It's still flat.
rebuild that
I
size.
drew them in elevation. That's what you have to see.
So that's solid somehow. Got connected there.
So like go into your elevation or something, yeah, and then draw them one on top of each other.
So you should have something that
So you just need to-
resembles what's up on the screen. Everyone get that to work out? I know some of you have a couple items that weren't working out. So then obviously to adjust the scale of this, you would just change your divisions, your different rows when you select your surface. Anytime you select a surface, you get these tools up at the top. where automatically it has the component highlighted. But if you don't want to see the components anymore, you can click that and that'll turn off the component. And then you can turn on the surface so you can see all your divisions. And so sometimes you have to toggle those on and off just to be able to select different things. If you turn on the pattern, you should just get a solid form. And anytime you change your U and your V's, you're going to see your pinwheel, and it's going to regenerate because it has to regenerate your whole entire form every single time you make an adjustment. I should cancel that.
Is it easier to just delete the pattern and then change the grid and then mirror it?
Yeah, if you want to really change, like play around with your grid and then your form, it's best to delete your pattern off of the surface and then adjust your form and then reapply it. Because your form, your pattern, as long as it works on every little component or part of your surface, if you go back and change your surface, let's say you have those 5 or 6 curves that we initially started out with in the semester, the different curve types. And if you were to change your end curves to something different and your form changes, then you can reapply your divisions, and actually you can keep your divisions how they are, and then just reapply your pattern to it. So, not sure what's going on there. This computer should be a lot faster. So what you could do if you want to, instead of having to delete the pattern, if you select your surface, off to the left, this is telling you what pattern you have. If you just go and select rectangle, that basically disassociates that curtain panel to it, and then you can, quickly maneuver around and change your grid spacing and then your actual form. So actually, this test surface that I made was actually made out of the different curve types from one of the earlier assignments. And so I can make some adjustments. And I'm not going to do this because it'll take a little bit of time, but I can come back here then after making all my adjustments and then select that curtain wall panel. So that's the best way if you want to start manipulating your form and maneuvering it around, because every little change you make, it'll have to regenerate.
Now, similar to how you can change the pattern on the form, can you change the type of curtain panel after the fact? Like, could you change it to a hexagon in the one we've been working on now, and then load that into the hexagon pattern? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically once you have a pattern applied, and of course I took mine off, so it'll take a minute to come back on, but if you individually select, like now that you have your curtain panels actually applied to your surface, if you individually hover over, you may have to use the tab button. You can actually select individual curtain panels, and when you select them, if you have more than one curtain panel loaded into your project, you could go down to the pull-down menu and then select a different curtain panel and basically add a, switch out the type.
In that one spot?
In that one spot. So that's a way, if you happen to have, you could actually make 2 or 3 different types of these digrids, with different adjustments already with the offsets. And then once you've applied it, you can actually go in and start selecting individual panels and then saying that it's current panel type 1, type 2, or type 3, and having your various offsets. That'd be kind of a manual way of getting some variation into your surface.
Do you have to have a pattern on that?
You have to have your component showing. And then tab over an individual component should allow you to select that individual square. Oh, it's still-
yeah, it does.
I'm still at 1%.
So if I select it,
It's failing.
My computer catch up here. So you see how when I hover over, it's selecting everything, but if I tab, I can select an individual curtain panel. And then if I have other ones loaded into your project, you can go ahead and select it and it will change it out. Everyone get that to work out? Okay. We're going to continue with this form a little bit more, and I'm going to introduce what's known as instance reporting parameters. So far we've been working with type parameters. Basically every time we've done any of our components in class and also with the homework. And if you recall, at one time we went over what an instance parameter is. Essentially, if you change these to be an instance parameter, every time you load it into a project, each individual panel has its own instance set of parameters that you could change. So before we make any kind of reporting parameters, I'm going to first change all of our offsets to be an instance parameter. And all we have to do is select one of the parameters, hit modify, and change it from type to instance, and hit OK. You should get a little default phrase that's within parentheses. That tells you that you've made that into an instance parameter. Go ahead and do that for all of them.
Jeremy, I'm getting error 4.
What's the error say?
Instant parameters can't be used in
Yep.
type
So-
parameters.
So change your formula ones first,
Okay.
and then your other one. It should resolve that. Basically, what that error is saying is if you try to exit out of this, if we've changed only the offset to be an instance parameter and left the other ones as a type, and if we were to exit out of this, it'll give us an error message because we've got a formula that's trying to reference an instance parameter and a type, and those two can't interchange. Now that you have changed all these to instances, if you hit OK, I'm going to hit save, and go ahead and load that back into the project and overwrite it. This can't take this long every time. Seems like everyone else has a faster computer. Where I'm going next here is because we've made instance parameters, you can individually select each one of these curtain panels, and off to the left you should have a set of properties that allows you to change your offset for each individual piece. So you could actually go around and individually select all of your curtain panels and manually change the numbers if you want to get some more variation within your form. As I said, Revit currently doesn't have the random number formula. Hopefully that comes into play pretty soon here, because that would make a lot of getting variation a lot easier in a lot of our forms.
I remember the first class you showed us And it's Ecotech model and it has like a red, part of the building is red because of the exposure to the sun and part is blue.
Mhm.
Can you, is that where you change it?
Yeah, there are, basically we can do something randomized and to a certain degree, and what that was, it was basically using parameters that were set to the Ecotech thermal analysis of the building. And so it was shading it, you know, a blue or green or red or yellow. So someone had actually wrote a script. See, in Revit you can actually do scripting. We're not going to get to that in this class. But wrote a script that translated that color information into the script and then brought the parameters into Revit so that it would say, okay, everything that was red had a value of 5 and everything that was blue maybe 1. And then that's how it got the variation. That'll be BIM methods part 2. Unless they can come up with that formula. And like I said, I don't know why they don't have that formula, because just Windows in general, if you were just programming or scripting, if you type in RND in any kind of script, it automatically picks a number from the computer between 0 and 1, so it's already built into the computer. It seems like something that could be easily accessed. But now that I've got this loaded in, like I said, you can select an individual panel, and if you look to the left, you can see that it has our offset parameters. And so I could come in here and change each individual one if I wanted to, and go around and do this for however many of these that I want to do. You can kind of see that as a variation. I'm going to undo both of that. And I'm going to go back to our curtain panel, and we're going to talk about instance reporting parameters, because this is a way that we can start to get a little more variation in the form based on a set of parameters that are unknown. For instance, right now we have drawn this curtain wall panel, or modeled it, and it has some relative scale to it. You know, we've put in some parameters such as, 6 inches for the sphere and 3 inches for the radius of the pipe. And we've got these offsets that are occurring, just based on a decimal value. But really the length and the width of all of this is kind of arbitrary. It's always going to be stretching and floating. We haven't set any kind of dimension to it. And when we look at our surfaces, if you were to individually select one of your components and look at the dimensioned area, you will see that from each division, am I getting the same? Okay, so wherever you are on the curve, and depending on how much variation you have in the curve, each component is slightly stretched differently. I can tell that by selecting my individual component and looking at the area. This one was 156 square feet. This other one I'm selecting is 180. So therefore, each of these divisions, even though we've said equally divided amongst a surface, there is a slight variation depending on how the divisions were occurring in the U and the V values of your surface. So basically what an instance reporting parameter will do, it will report a set of information, and that's all it's going to do. It's going to report something. So basically I'm going to make a dimension that will report whenever this panel is on a particular surface, what is its length of each of these legs. It will vary and it'll be different, and that's why it has to be an instance reporting parameter. It has to be an instance. What I'm going to do is select everything, turn on our filter option, let's check none, and this time we need our adaptive points, and we can do our reference lines and reference points and dimensions. Pretty much the same thing we did last time. And then select isolate element. Now, everything, because of this object, is constantly changing and is never really orthogonal. When we start to set dimensions, actual dimension strings to this form, we have to be aware of the plane that we're going to associate it with. If we don't associate this correctly, when you bring it into your next element or your test surface, you will get an error message every time. So, you can kind of see right now we've gone through a little bit of a process. Every time you've done a set of components that are changing based on parameters, you want to load it into a test surface, test it out, and make sure it works. We know up until this point, hopefully, everybody's component has worked thus far. We want to know that because once we get to this next step, if we get an error message, we know that it's something that we just did, and we can go back and try to resolve the situation. If you try to do this all in one swoop, and you load it in, you get an error message. As you've seen, Revit doesn't specifically tell you what's wrong. And you will have to go back and try to figure out, well, did I do my reference planes and my dimensions in the right location, or did I snap to the right piece, or what isn't working? And so when you start to build any kind of component, you want to go through that process every time, this kind of trial and error way of processing. This is very similar to what you would do in programming, or even in Grasshopper, with scripting. You always do kind of this trial and error way of working through processing to make sure that what you're doing is working before you add in more, I guess, complexity to the situation. So let's go ahead and do our reporting parameters. I'm going to set up a couple more properties or parameter types. And this time we're going to let's do 4 parameters. Each one of these will be a length parameter. And I'm just going to call, I'll say like T1A for triangle 1, leg A. That's what that stands for. I'm going to make it an instance, and then I'm going to check the box that says reporting. I'll hit OK, and you should notice that when you hit OK, it's grayed out, meaning you can't snap in or select into here and try to change that value. You can't manually change any kind of value that's a report. It's just going to reference something that we eventually associate it with. I'm going to do the same thing. I'll call it T1B, do instance reporting, and then do the same thing as a T2. So T2A, T2B. And if you really want to get organized, you can select these reporting parameters that you just made, and under modify, instead of grouping the parameter under dimensions, you could select another category. So I could call this more like analytical or analysis results. All that's going to do is organize it in your browser or your dialog box. This isn't a requirement, but as you get a lot of different parameters, you may want to begin to organize where they fall. If you look at some of the tutorials from a lot of the guys doing a lot of digital design, this dialog box is going to be full of parameters. And if you have them organized, you can toggle, kind of expand and collapse each of these individual kind of items. So if you had, for instance, hundreds of parameters, you could easily kind of scroll through and find them. So anyway, we've got our, and all of these should now say report in parentheses instead of default. That's how you know you've set it to the correct parameter. I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to draw a dimension. But before I draw a dimension, I'm going to set the work plane, because in Revit, every dimension has to be orthogonal in a sense, in that when you dimension from one end to the other, those ends have to actually be on the same plane or be perpendicular or parallel with one each other when you select it. If it's not, it won't allow you to strike a dimension. So what I'm going to do is hit set, and then you should have a placement plane selection box. That's not what I want. I need to hit dimension first, sorry. Hit align dimension, and then select set. I guess it's not. What's going on? Hold on. Okay, if you kind of rotate around a little bit, I kind of had to do this, but you might be okay. If you hit the dimension, and we'll hit set plane, we just want to hover over one of the reference lines that are on the edge. And actually, I want to know which one's my triangle 1. So that should be my points that are associated with the first offset. So that's this triangle. I made it, you kind of make your offsets a little extreme. I know that this one is, because I made this a 0.4, this is going to be my triangle 1. Okay, so now I'm going to set my dimension to one of those end lines, and then I'm going to make sure that I hover over an adaptive point. So when I hover over it, you should get the point that's highlighted, and it should say adaptive point. Click that, and go to the next one, and make sure you click on that adaptive point. Looks like,
Placement form instead of adaptive.
what was that?
I'm getting placement form instead of adaptive.
You might have to tab over a couple times until you get adaptive. You probably have one of these placement points instead of that corner point.
It says adaptive points, placement point 1. Is that the same?
Adaptive point, yeah. So I'm going to do that one dimension. That's all I'm going to do for now. I'm going to select that and make that label equal to T1A. And now when you look at your dialog properties, you should see that your T1A is now reporting 11 foot, in my case it's 11 foot 2 and 29 1/28 inches. You might want to test that by moving your point and make sure that your dimension and everything else changes.
Mine was not.
Oh my God, mine's not.
Then you need to redo your dimension.
Mine,
Make sure you're snapping to the adaptive point.
mine, like this one, it allows me to get to a point and stuff, but this one is not letting me.
If you can't get to a point, you need to rotate your view around. Sometimes your view might be stuck at a different angle. So I'm going to do another one just to show you again. I'm going to take the other leg, and again I'm going to select my dimension, click on set, my work plane, and then pick the reference line, so it says adaptive points, placement point 1, reference. That's what you want to click. Next one, it says adaptive points, placement point 4, reference. Your numbers might be different. And I'm going to set the next one to T2A. And again, if you move your points around, it should change. Who's still having trouble?
That's what I did. That's what I did. Just the line first. He's a line first. Now hit point. Now go to the point. Now so you do it for each. There's the two sides. Thank you.
So, we need to just start with the dimensions.
And then set it to
So,
T.
like one of the exterior lines, the green one.
I was like, so you said line and point. This is two.
Okay, what's going on?
That would smart house. You can see your shit. I was like, I am like clicking through and you're not coming. Yeah, oh, we're not saying to yet.
Okay. So what were you doing beforehand that wasn't working? Were you not selecting the reference line?
I was,
Oh, I said,
yeah, I was
Okay.
mistake my plan.
yeah, okay. Yep, so if you're having trouble trying to get your dimensions to work out, it's mainly probably due to the fact that you're not on the correct work plane, and it won't allow you to strike a dimension. So some of you have probably already jumped ahead, but we're going to do the same thing on the bottom. It really doesn't matter, you know, which one's A or B, just as long as they're different. Oops, this was supposed to be T1B. So on one side of the triangle, you should have your T1A and T1B, and then on the other offset version, across the diagonal, you should have your T2A and T2B. I'm going to hit save, and if we load this into the project and say overwrite the parameters, my computer will take a while. What's that error you keep getting, Brian?
I just, think I'm using the same. Yeah, I was using the same for every voice.
Do all of your other, like, you guys seem to regenerate right away. How come mine computer's taking so long?
Mine takes
Forever.
Huh?
Mine takes forever.
Okay. Maybe some of you already.
Conspiracy.
Yeah.
It's the projector.
Maybe next time I should do a smaller surface with like 4 components. That might be better.
It's okay, it gives us time for questions.
And that's always computers can handle.
Okay.
We will probably crash a computer or two in our future.
I don't know
Is
what
that
this is.
I've always crashed at least 2 or 3 of these
Yeah, I'm
apples.
guessing all my things are supposed to be the same.
In Rhino or Grasshopper, Revit.
Do you have a PC or a Mac that you have partition?
We still don't.
For personal, I do PC. All PC.
You like NVIDIA?
You
I don't crash my PC though.
You run.
Yeah, because this was built to run on a PC, not through Apple versus who can. Man,
Will
this
they
is
ever
pretty
release
nice.
it for Mac? I mean, it's
Um,
just for AutoCAD.
Yeah, and see, the trouble is like even with like Rhino and all the, like right now they're trying to write Rhino for Mac and it still has a lot of bugs. It's because pretty much all these programs are written with some form of computer basic, like VBScript and all that type of stuff. And Macs completely took that out of their operating system because that's what people write viruses with. That's why, you probably don't get as many viruses on a Mac. It's because, most of that is written towards, VBScript and scripting on the Windows side. But in consequence to that, a lot of programs have a lot of trouble trying to translate over. So they have to completely basically rewrite the programs
Awesome.
for the two.
When is it gonna make graphics for Macs?
That's what we were just
That's what I
saying.
asked him.
Yeah, I don't know when that's gonna happen. As soon as they master it for the Windows side.
I think I'll have a career.
And I thought that's the whole point.
Okay, so I've got my reporting parameters to regenerate again. I'll go ahead and save that part of the project. Now you will notice that when you hover over an individual component and select it, you should see off to the left in your properties your reporting parameters that you just created. And it should be reporting for that one particular element all the different lengths of the sides that we just dimensioned. So you can test it out to make sure that it's working by selecting a different component and make sure that all those numbers change. If you're going around selecting every single component and it's all exactly the same number, most likely your dimensions haven't been snapped to the adaptive points, meaning that those reporting dimensions are always reporting, like, let's say 10 feet. If for some reason you get that would be the cause of that situation.
But there's still never a way to change.
We just set with the dimensions.
Excuse me?
In the forms I applied it to, if I select the individual, it doesn't show the those dimensions over here.
You may not have made them, did you make them reporting?
Yeah.
I was just trying to figure out what it is.
When you loaded it into the Rhino, did you
I mean, I'm just gotta use the difference in colors.
Just talking with you.
I think I should have
Yeah, if you don't get the items reporting, it's also possible, hey, listen up. If you get the parameters that aren't reporting over here, again, if you're not snapped to the adaptive components or the adaptive points, that will be one issue. The other issue could be that you've actually applied, like if you did a save as of your family and then loaded it into this particular surface, you probably have the old family name that's associated with it and you just have to switch it out. So just be aware of what you're naming things and then also where you're applying it. Okay, so basically all we did was make some information report. That's great. But what's interesting to me is that each one of these are reporting a different set of information. So we're kind of doing a workaround a little bit with the random number formula in that we're getting some kind of number that's going to be different from panel to panel that we might be able to associate in some computational formula that would also allow us to make some other future associations to get some variation. Since we're getting close to the end of class, what we'll do is I'm going to reset. I'm back in my curtain panel, and I just unhid everything. basically, I want to use these reporting parameters to be associated with this offset value so that when I get some kind of answer to a formula, let's say I'm going to find the area of a triangle. So I've got my base times my height, and I can do divided by 2, and I get my area of my triangle. Each of those areas are always going to be different because we're always going to have different lengths for our height and our base. I'm going to set up a couple more calculations. I'm just going to call these parameters calc1, and it has to be an instance. And this is going to be a number because I want this eventually to be associated with my offset, and my offsets are a number, which is a decimal value between 0 and 1. So I've got a calc1, and I'm going to do a calc2. And it's a type parameter number, and it's an instance. If you want to organize it, I might put this under constraints. I wish you could make your own categories, but you kind of have to choose from what's available in the list. So we're going to do a pretty crazy formula. Is everyone ready?
Oh, yeah.
All right. I want to get the area of a triangle. So now we have to start going back to our trigonometry and geometry and all that fun stuff. Base times height divided by 2. So we have a base and a height, which is a T1A and a T1B. I'm going to put in parentheses for, you know, I named this one wrong. It should be calc 2. So for calc 1, in parentheses, I'm going to type in T1A times T1B, parentheses, divided by 2. And when you hit enter, you'll get the 2 will have a square foot symbol that comes on after it. Revit likes to keep everything the same units, so that's all it's doing. You don't have to worry about it. The next thing I'm going to do is select that formula and hit Control-C on my keyboard and go into Calc 2 and hit Control-V.
What is that? Is that SF after the 2?
When you hit enter, SF will appear.
Oh.
That's square foot. So under Calc 2, when I did the Control-C, Control-V, then I'm going to just go in and change my T2-1 and T1A and T1B to T2A, T2B. This way I don't have to retype that whole formula. Now you should notice you get a pretty large, a fairly large number. It's definitely greater than 1. So I've got a 58 and a 77. You'll have something different, but it's definitely going to be greater than 1. I basically want to get a decimal value so that I'm always going to be under 1. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to put all of this in parentheses for Calc 1.
Including the square foot.
Yeah, include the square foot. Otherwise, Revit will put it back anyway. And I'm going to do a 1 divided by at the very front. Oops. Of each one. And then I see that I get a very small number. I get a 0.01. So I think I'll up this number to try 15 and we do calc 2 as 20. That looks better. Yeah, looks about the same. Let's do 15 and 25 divided by. All I'm trying to do is get calc 1 and calc 2 to be a little bit different, kind of like what we've been working with in our offsets. Everyone get that? Now under offset 1 and offset 2, I'm just going to, in the formula, make them equal to calc 1 and calc 2. I'm going to hit save. This will probably be the last time I can load this in right now. And then load it into your project. You'll probably, you should, if everything's been working up until this point, as long as you've typed in some formula similar to what we've gone over so far, you should get some variation from one curtain panel to another. But it's going to be pretty slight because, from one panel to the other, the numbers are only changing slightly, so obviously we're only going to see a slight variation. This will take probably till the end of class here. What we'll do is, for the beginning of next class, I want to introduce, has everyone done any form of scripting or Grasshopper here? No. Everyone took like computational methods, right?
No.
Okay, so does anyone know what a conditional statement is? The if-then statements. So for those of you that don't, what we're going to start with next class is we can start to write in conditional statements into formulas. A conditional statement is you have to test some condition. So you're going to say if this condition is less than something or equals something or whatever you're testing, you're either going to get a true or a false that's associated with it. It'll be a yes or a no. So basically what we can do is in this formula box, we can test it and say, if, let's say, calc 1 is less than 20, then use this value. If it is greater than 20, then use another value. And so in that one formula, we can put this conditional statement in and start to add in a little bit more variation and even some choices that might create some more variation within our form. But we'll introduce that next time, and I'm still generating here. Next time I'm going to make a simpler surface. I think
Mine got an error message when I
Five-
did it.
Yeah, mine did.
It like wrapped up to a certain point, and then it just showed the two curves on the edge and said,
it said it failed.
I think the form just like tightens too much at the end because
How many got an error message? I see
I got
boxes.
different, and
What's your error?
it says that it has type and instance parameters, but it won't be changing.
So you should have, I'm probably there now.
This type parameter is driven by instance parameters.
Well, mine were.
Yeah, so your formulas, so your offset, and offset 2, click on that and modify. Make sure it's Yeah, so, hold on a second. So for today, this is all we're going to get to, but you can kind of see that you should have different lengths and a little bit of variation within this form. For, was it Tuesday?
Yeah.
Was it Thursday already? For Tuesday, if you didn't complete this part, I want you to make sure you have this component ready to go for Tuesday, because we're going to be continuing on just a little bit with some conditional statements. And then I want you also to test this on one of your complex forms, whether it's the same one you've been working with or a different one within your bridge. Other than that, keep working on your bridge. If there's still some things that you wanna, or tower, still some things that you wanna fix, or, you know, kind of, I know a lot of you still have a few things that aren't maybe working correctly, or you wanna change something, use this time to, you know, further develop your project. On Tuesday, we're gonna do the conditional statement, and then I'm gonna go over just another, some other methods of creating like another curtain panel form. Because ultimately what you're gonna be doing is finding a personalized form that you're gonna create yourself. That's not gonna be, it'll be based on the information that we've already done in class, but you're gonna come up with your own design that you're gonna eventually apply to either your tower or your bridge components, particularly the complex form. And we'll talk about that on Tuesday.
I'm getting an error message when I'm trying to put in the formula.
Now, I'll walk around now for any questions.
Did it work better with the simplified? Or they have smaller, yeah.
And make sure this
Or
works.
did you know?
I